Hey everyone, today we've got a brand new story for you. In today's tale, we'll follow a guy named Lu Fug, who belongs to the family of Yi, and is also the protagonist of this story. But if you're sitting there wondering why his name is so corny, it's because he's been living for over 2,000 years. The reason is that he possesses the ability of immortality. Meanwhile, others comment that during that time, wealth, prosperity, and peace were the three main criteria for giving people names. But our protagonist doesn't care about that. Besides, he doesn't even care about his immortality. He considers this ability useless, and because of it, he ended up losing the most important thing. Well, I don't know exactly what that is because we need to understand the whole story. There's also another guy who's addicted to smelling papers, but you know, there are people out there who love to sniff some sweaty documents. However, our protagonist's goal is to get rid of this curse of eternal life. By freeing himself from it, he wants to return to his childhood and live his life fully and originally. At first, he thought this was just a wish, but unfortunately, he ended up finding, and to make things even worse, he was kind of abandoned by everyone. One of these people ends up invading a place and prepares to capture him, but he can easily defend himself. After all, to become the most powerful, he had to become the sword of the family. But even though he was mentally prepared, things still developed in a way that far exceeded his expectations. In the middle of a mission, he finds a boy abandoned and thrown in the middle of the trash. But here's the thing, his goal was to return to the body of that boy to live a peaceful life without immortality. However, to understand everything about how our protagonist got to that point, where he faced monsters and some pretty strong opponents, we need to go back to the beginning. The scene shifts to a city where heavy rain is falling. At the same time, the scene cuts to an alley where we find our protagonist along with some other guys. Amid it all, our protagonist wonders what they did to end up like this. Suddenly, things just turned out this way. After all, among the garbage, they found a boy who appeared out of nowhere. But today was practically New Year's Eve, and the upcoming year, 2025, was approaching. Meanwhile, people were commenting on TV that some people, or more specifically, girls aged 12 to 15, were disappearing out of nowhere. The journalist simply advises people not to go out alone at night because it's dangerous. However, the people in that house decide to go out anyway because they want to visit some relatives. Besides, they ask Raphael, who was in the room, not to go anywhere and to stay locked inside, to which she agrees. Meanwhile, we see her staring at her cell phone and sending a message to a certain person. In that chat, she messages someone unknown expressing her frustration because she can't leave. Furthermore, the guy on the other end starts mentioning some crazy contacts out of nowhere. Then, he asks if he could visit her house. Without thinking twice, she agrees, without realizing that the person she was talking to might be an old man. But the conversation was mainly about bank accounts. Suddenly, she sends him an invitation to come to her house, but since it was already late, she asks him to come the next day. Here, we are introduced to Lu Fug, a guy who is single. At around 7 a.m., he is likely to arrive. The sky wasn't very bright yet, and while he was lost in thought, someone suddenly barges in. He gets mad because they should have knocked on the door, and he wonders why he even wants privacy. Both of them were already too old for this kind of behavior. However, the reason for the abrupt entrance was simply to call him to the family meeting. After all, today was Chinese New Year's Eve, and they were supposed to gather the whole family for a big celebration. Besides, the family requested that he start making some drawings and talismans, as the drawings he created ended up being quite helpful. Quite a lot. They managed to solve some problems after talking about it. He ends up saying that they are some zombie relatives, and moreover, they have their own traditions. Poor should practically imitate them. And celebrating the new year was practically becoming a human for the year-end party. This was our protagonist who stood against everything, but another old man ended up kind of revealing that he learned a lot from humans. Moreover, they came from China and have lived here for more than a few thousand years, and their goal is always to defend and respect the local culture. In short, he should be attending the meeting. Even more so, he should control his foul mouth a bit. And as soon as he says that, he slams the door, leaving our protagonist irritated with things. But now that the silence has returned, only one thing is missing. He forgot to lock the door. So he runs and locks the door, but there's still one more thing: the window closed. Now that everything was resolved, he ended up commenting that what he just said was simply some things that didn't make sense, but the most important thing now was to stick his hand in his pocket. Only then does he pull out a mandrake, and only then does he begin to sniff that thing, ending up saying that this is the only thing that really makes him happy. But after sniffing a little, he ends up stopping because the feeling of happiness quickly fades away. However, outside the place where he is, he ends up appearing, but his old and slightly worn-out form ends up disappearing, causing him to transform into a slightly younger form. Being young, he realizes that things have gotten a little better, but our time passes. 6:57 in the morning. He ends up arriving at the room of that girl named Anis, the same one he called the night before. But as soon as he arrived, she wonders who this guy would be. But out of nowhere, our protagonist pulls out a talisman from who knows where and ends up placing it on his face. After doing such a thing, she simply falls unconscious. On the other hand, he ends up wondering what she wanted to say. Moreover, the girls nowadays, to him, are quite developed, but this one he just, let's say, picked up here is a bit heavy. However, he needed to take her to the room, so he ends up heading to the room. Upon arriving in the room, he places her on the bed. Her appearance really seemed good, as expected of a girl her age, and to him, there was a possibility that some photos could be, let's say, fake. But now he could take the next step. For this, he ends up tearing some things, and with what he tore, he approaches the girl lying on the bed, lifting some things up. But at the moment he did such a thing, from behind that wardrobe, some green auras and some black smoke start coming out. And after that, two ghosts appear. The two ghosts, of course, go after the guy who was approaching the unconscious girl lying on the bed. Now that he saw the ghosts appear, he could finally give up on that stupid idea he wanted to do before because being patient was too good at the moment. So, the ghost passes by, but at the moment it did, he saw some things placed behind them. Those were some talismans that caught his attention. But to make things worse, the talisman drawn there was the one he himself had drawn. This means that someone within his family was plotting something, but the most important thing is that he will be able to expose this person. However, the first thing he wanted so much, he ended up achieving there on the bed with the girl. And despite not knowing what her family members basically want with the girl, he simply is not a person who treats guests with sincerity. So now, he wouldn't treat these guys here, who would be his guests, with such sincerity either, because he needed to know who placed those corpse puppet talismans there. After all, if he told, he would be making things easier by letting these guys off easily. But otherwise, if they didn't want to basically withdraw or tell him who did it, he would not let things go unpunished. The zombies end up stopping, but only after feeling the threat he made, and they get irritated with it. Then, both go towards our protagonist, but as they approach him, he simply raises his hand upwards, and only then he comments that he warned them. And at the moment he spoke about it, some lightning-fast strikes head toward those zombies. The blows that our protagonist had somewhat placed on them. It was enough to knock the two down, but knocking them down wasn't quite enough because we could see that the two hadn't been defeated. They were still standing. He realizes that not even the attack he had just performed had much of an effect, but he also notices the lights surrounding the corpse, which ends up revealing another talisman. This talisman looks quite familiar to him because the talisman he just spotted was also something of his. He realizes that these disgusting little lambs were trying to use something he himself created against him. But here, he reveals something to us. An enhanced talisman, a second-level talisman. This not only strengthens the body but also creates a thin shield layer. So instead of attacking these undead bodies with brute force, it was better to bite his finger. As soon as he bites his finger, he begins to draw something special on the talisman. But at that moment, the corpses beg him to stop. However, He finishes what he wanted and throws the talisman he just drew with his blood toward the corpses. They had neither the idea nor the speed to dodge, and one of them was caught, while the other was also caught, feeling the power coming from our protagonist. This thing ended up swallowing those talismans he had drawn before, and those things, minutes later, ended up disappearing completely. He feels he is losing strength, so he needs to get out of there. But our protagonist won't let them, as he approaches one of them who was thinking of running away, placing his hand on their face. He also quickly approaches the other one who was beside him, grabbing both of their faces. He simply uses the dimensional cuts. The cuts he had just used were potent enough to slice each of these undead into pieces, ultimately turning each of them into dust. But now that he has turned each one into dust, he can finally relax. However, as he relaxes, he begins to wonder who might be the mastermind behind all this. In the clan today, there are many suspects, so he should keep an eye on some people. Moreover, their puppet skills only allow for simple consciousness. They do not accept some of his conditions. And now, it proves that the person behind this is using rather cruel methods. However, someone behind the door calls for Xiang, the girl who was lying on the bed, and comments that she is back. As soon as she arrives, she opens the door. But when she does, she is surprised by the snow and, at the same time, the open window. It was something she had asked to be closed before they left. And what she ends up understanding is that people these days no longer listen to anyone. While she was talking about that, our scene shifts to our hero on top of a building. He introduces himself as Lu Fugi, and he has lived in this world for over 5,000 years. He belongs to a zombie family, but at the age of 15, two boys of the same age underwent some kind of mysterious rituals. After that ritual, he gained the immortality that humanity has always dreamed of. But at the same time, he lost those little friends of his. The zombies he controls are extremely powerful, but to control such power, he needs to cut his buddy down there. His buddy doesn't have all that power, so only by cutting it can he better control his abilities. However, there's a catch. Our protagonist has lived for 5,000 years, but in those 5,000 years, he has never had a girlfriend. And the secret lies in his virginity. The kid has lived for over 5,000 years without losing it, but now he can no longer hold back. Until last year, he developed a cruel talisman. But by breaking this seal, he could finally embrace the power of a man. This talisman he created, although it lasts only 24 hours, can bring his body back to its original 15-year-old form, the time when he was a man. But this unlocking talisman has a massive side effect and can only be used once every 6 months. Leaving aside the headaches like the disappearance of those girls for now, he should stop and have a little fun. Since he used that talisman, he then begins to look up, and only after that does he look down, where he finally finds his little buddy after 5,000 years. He even asks his little boy to wait because today he is going to make him have a lot of fun. While he was thinking about the fun he would have with his big buddy R, the scene cuts to him downtown, where he was playing basketball on the arcade machines. In those machines, our protagonist is having fun and manages to win against each opponent. Not satisfied with that, he goes to another machine and ends up breaking it easily. And to really break things, he goes to another jumping game where he ends up breaking some parts, but keeps jumping anyway. At that moment, he notices something strange. In this place, there is not a single girl around. However, this distracts him a little and he ends up falling to the ground. Because his friend is down there, he feels a sharp pain. But after the pain passes, he goes to a restaurant. In this restaurant, he eats a little, but after that, he goes to a sauna. In this place, he starts laughing at the faces of the young guys around, realizing that they have quite a bold attitude. But this place was very nice. Here, he even thinks that those guys might be the kind who mess around with each other. But that doesn't matter for now. All the initial appetizers have been served. Now it was time for the main course. At that moment, he faces something written in front of him, hotel. And this place is where our hero is going to play with his friend for real, because after all, to be a real man, he had to go through these paths. So he takes a deep breath, and after breathing deeply, he thinks about entering. However, he is quickly kicked out of the place. The reason was that minors were not allowed to enter. But he misunderstood. He just wanted to relax. Still, he keeps asking to be let in because this was the only place as good as this one. Being expelled several times, he starts wondering what he should do, whether to face another place or just give up. But there, some guys end up making him lose all his will. Falling to the ground, he starts thinking about what he should do until he begins to cry a little. In front of him, a guy appears who looks somewhat like a brother to him. This guy stares at our protagonist and seems to recognize him too. This guy, whom he has known for a long time, though he can't remember exactly how long, is someone he is very familiar with. Although the members of their family have special abilities, their lifespans were not much different from those of ordinary people. But as the only immortal person in the family, he eventually lost count of how many family members had come and gone. This guy, who already wears diapers, is someone he has known since he was a kid. His father was one of his direct disciples. His grandfather was once saved by him, and his great-grandfather was someone he personally promoted. However, for some reason, ever since he was a child, this guy has always managed to intimidate our protagonist. He even thinks that this guy sees himself as his superior, but to the kid, he is just an old pervert who only thinks about women. What he says ends up irritating some of the elders, and one of them grabs a hoe and goes after the boy. But this elder is the only person he truly trusts. Returning to the present moment, he tells the elder everything that happened before. He even suspects that someone from the family is involved. After all, he is the one who collects the most talismans. But he changes the subject, asking if by any chance the elder had gone to the messenger's house to conduct some investigations. However, the old man quickly changes the topic, asking him to use a talisman to transform him back into his elderly form. Only after that does he ask the protagonist to attend the annual meetings. As he talks about this, he says he will keep an eye on things. Meanwhile, the scene cuts to another place where people are having fun, some with a little romance here, others with a little romance there. But in the middle of all this, we find our protagonist and the old man sitting there alone, with no girl beside them. While sitting there peacefully, thinking about what to do next, one of the guys appears and starts mocking him, noticing that he finally arrived. But putting aside all the teasing, he ends up thanking our hero because the talisman he creates has been very helpful to the family. Or at least, he hopes to be praised by the king. At the banquet, after a long time, he finally appears. The king of the zombies from the zombie family, the Emperor Sheng, 41 years old, accompanied by several beautiful girls. But everyone, upon meeting him, ends up somewhat bowing to him. Aside from that, he asks everyone to sit down, and they all thank the king. While sitting, our protagonist eats, and at the same time thinks that he has already met many people with the title of Zombie King. However, the Zombie King calls our hero and ends up saying that everyone in the family is grateful to our protagonist because he drew some talismans there, which ultimately helped him a lot. But the Zombie King ends up knowing one thing. Our protagonist is not interested in many things, so he asks him to at least like this particular thing here. However, another person asks him to stop for a moment and comments that he understands why he wanted to thank our hero for helping millions 1,000 years ago, allowing his family to grow. But there is that one thing. He ended up doing some things, so he should be judged by his actions and by the justice of his family. Then, he calls for him and ends up wondering what he meant. On New Year's Eve, a day of joy and a place where one should not spoil the fun, he apologizes because he has no intention of causing any problems. But, unwilling to cause trouble while already causing it, he points toward the back and comments that he seriously violated some family prohibitions. He broke the seal on his own and returned to his youth. Of course, saying that would not simply make everyone believe he was telling the truth. So, to prove it, he takes out some photos secretly taken of him and throws them on the floor. The pictures show the guy at XO, drinking some things, and at the same time, hitting on some girls. But the main thing is that he tried to go to AB to get those women there, but needed to pay. even though he did not have much information. Earlier today, before dawn, Lou sneaked into a minor girl's house, and only God knows what he ended up doing there. But he assumes that he did not go to the girl's house simply to do charity work. On the other hand, our protagonist, who already knew the whole story, simply stays quiet. The people there, as a couple, simply start staring at our protagonist. Even the waitresses who were serving everything stopped to listen to the story. The zombie king who heard all this simply has nothing more to do. He closes his eyes, and only after all of this does he raise his hand. Then the waitresses and everyone around there end up leaving the place. After that, he calls our hero and asks him to explain whether what she just said was entirely true. Then he comments that he indeed made a mistake on that matter, but he still wants to explain a few things to him. Also, everyone knows the difficulties and secrets of the wealthy. Not to mention that after so many years, it is almost inevitable for a human to do such things. But the zombie king, who has been around our protagonist, believes that he would never cross the line. So, he asks for a more thorough investigation. Then, he turns around and comments that he really does not trust our protagonist much, because, normally, he would not have that in him. And even if he did, he would not be able to handle it, leaving the guy completely pale. At that moment, everyone in the place starts laughing at both our protagonist and his companion, but he asks them to stop and then offers the guy the opportunity to decide the punishment for our protagonist since our hero ultimately broke the family rule, something he, unfortunately, cannot overlook. Then, he comments that fate was sealed in his heart. There is always a plan. At this moment, we find our protagonist in the background, who was doing fine until he felt a certain pressure. But everything continues after the party. The party left a mess in the house, but after the entire punishment, he thought he would receive a much harsher penalty. However, the punishment he received from the zombie king was simple. It was just to clean the hall. Moreover, if they wanted to kill our protagonist, someone from the family would have to take over the position he holds. In the end, he even thinks that maybe all of this is just part of that guy's fun. He ends up commenting that he committed a re-grav and is going back a bit to his youth, so he should be serving his punishment. But since the boy isn't hurt or anything, he will be leaving. Besides, the blame for being at the dinner fell on that old man, so he should be helping our protagonist. However, he received the punishment alone, so he should handle it by himself. Moreover, he would avoid more problems. Our protagonist ends up noticing him sneaking away and realizes that this hall is crazy. They gave him only a broom to take care of the entire hall. As he retreats, he finds some things hanging from the ceiling. These things eventually start moving. At that moment, a hand rises, and some cloths fly toward our protagonist. In the end, our hero ends up being wrapped by these cloths and blacks out. After a while, he finally wakes up. By then, they had already taken some important things from our hero lying on the floor. Now they wonder who these people are. They then comment that our protagonist shouldn't know who they are. Apparently, one of them holds a personal grudge against our protagonist, but aside from the grudge, they are just there to carry out some transactions. They then mention that maybe the person below is Fugi UI, and that they heard from some people that he can draw some special unlocking talismans. If he manages to show them how to draw those talismans, they might spare him from being hurt. He says that if he refuses, it's his unlucky day anyway. He hasn't even been with a single girl, was humiliated publicly, and maybe what he did isn't over yet. After all, he still ended up being tied up by them. Annoyed by this, he starts yelling at them and then uses some talismans that break the ropes, releasing a strange smoke. To avoid being caught by the unknown smoke, they cover their faces. A little later, we find our protagonist, who easily freed himself from the things tying him up. What they did went too far, and now they will pay. Realizing he broke free, one of them comments to another that he recognized him. He was really that guy. Knowing who he is, they point in another direction and ask someone to block a few of the main hallways. Obviously, he obeys. At that moment, while running, our protagonist quickly turns and heads toward him. Now he comments that he has done many things, but there should be limits. Approaching, he pauses briefly and then uses some ropes like a slingshot. This time, he is using it as an explosive weapon. After preparing it, the thing flies toward his opponent, hitting him directly. However, behind him, another person is drawing talismans on the ground. After finishing the drawing, red lightning starts emerging from the floor and floats a little. This shield he just created is supposed to block anything. He believes he is completely safe. However, a few moments later, our protagonist appears behind him and comments that it's his turn, until another person behind him says it's not. After all, he now needs to calm the situation. At that moment, he is surprised to see that the guy who took one of his most powerful attacks is completely fine. The man now asks him to go over there. He begins to glow a little, and our protagonist starts to stare at him, wondering what is going on. But before the fight can continue, the story shifts back a bit to provide some context about modern society. In this era, humanity searches for life beyond the planet, unaware that on Earth, there are 3 great families with special abilities. These families are located in southern Europe and southern ancient Egypt. Although humanity doesn't fully know about these families, they are represented in fictional movies as zombies, vampires, and mummies, 3 different cultures and 3 different schools. But these families truly coexist. According to the family's historical records, thousands of years ago, the 3 great families fought wars of varying scales. However, for some reason, they recently ended this war and returned to peace. This is because they discovered a truth. The tripartite powers have a containment relationship. Essentially, the zombie family defeats the vampire family is effective against the mummy family, and the mummy family, in turn, is effective against the zombie family, and he belongs to the mummy family. At that moment, as this is being explained, we see him advancing toward our protagonist. The guy takes a few hits. Moments later, he is sitting down, drawing talismans. If the fight continues, he knows he will take more hits. He asks to focus, but he says he's fine. After all, he is a specialist in drawing talismans. And at that moment, he speaks. About that, he starts drawing. He draws what they wanted so much, the high-difficulty unlocking talisman. So, after finishing the drawing, he shows it to the guys. They then start looking a little closer at the drawing he made, even commenting that it looks a bit different. After all, the drawing was somewhat poorly done. He even has some knowledge of Chinese characters, and what he drew is definitely not the unlocking talisman. Irritated by this, our protagonist thinks these guys were demons. So, he grabs the talisman and puts it on himself. The moment he does, a glow emerges from him. A glow that becomes so intense, it generates extremely high pressure outside the mansion. At that moment, he realizes that he couldn't knock them down before, but defeating them now would be easier. It was the sonic explosion, a special flash talisman that ignores any kind of ability. However, this also ends up attracting everyone's attention outside, meaning that in 5 minutes the place will be completely surrounded. But within the family, there is a certain peace contract among the 3 great families, none of them interfering with, influencing, or participating in any matters of the other families. What he did was a serious crime. Yet before that, he wanted to see who they really were. After the smoke cleared, he sees the 2 figures, and for some reason, he recognizes them quite well, which leaves our protagonist extremely surprised. What doesn't surprise him, though, is that they dared to enter his house. He simply comments that it was indeed them, but now that he found them, he reflects on how long it has been since the 3 of them last met. The first time they saw each other was basically when they were 15 years old, which marked the beginning of everything. But if you really think about it, it had been thousands of years since they last encountered each other, something you could count on one hand. The deepest impression was left that year when the 3 races suddenly decided to sign a peace contract, since at the time they were essentially in their prime. It was also then that he ended up engraving the memory of the 3. Meanwhile, as all of this is happening outside the door, someone starts running toward it. But moments later, some guards appear, wondering what is going on. At that point, when she appears, We see our protagonist acting all casual. At the same time, he turns around and is surprised that they really came, but she wonders if it was him who used that flash talisman. After all, he had mentioned earlier that if anyone used such a talisman, it meant their life was in total danger. So they came as quickly as possible to help. However, in the end, they didn't find anything. In fact, the enemies had already fled. The real reason for calling them there was simple. He wanted their help to clean the mansion a bit faster because doing it alone would take him all day. Moreover, to make things worse, they had seen our protagonist being humiliated at that banquet the night before and even sent him to clean the hall by himself. That's why he called for their help. Since it was already late at night, he decided to ask the elite, the first-class rooms, to come and assist. However, she becomes irritated by what our protagonist just said. She simply points out that he should clean everything thoroughly because they won't help him clean anything. And since he had basically summoned them for no good reason, she storms off after punching him on the head, leaving a bump behind. As they leave, we see our protagonist using a talisman to return to his youth. But at the moment he returns to his youthful form, his companions, his brothers from his past life, show up, saying that he might not be as smart as he thinks, but in the end, he did well. Since he wasn't supposed to go against his brothers, he ends up admitting that, yes, it was a good prank. Despite being so intelligent, he underestimated his own cleverness, because not long ago he had drawn some talismans that turned out to be useless. On the other hand, our protagonist says that those talismans were for explosions. But now, he draws the real talismans and hands them over to them. They start wondering why the protagonist was so eager to help them. Out of nowhere, he invents a poem saying that in China, there is a saying that a person cannot die on a full stomach. And to make things better, he just wanted to do the basics, help them because they were his brothers. Well, not dying on a full stomach wasn't so bad, but ignoring our protagonist's nonsense, they receive a sharp remark from him, urging them to start eating quickly since their desire was to return to their youth and enjoy the things they once ate freely. Thus, with desire, they ended up placing the talisman, and at that moment when they placed the talisman, both of them began to feel that youth returning to them. At that moment, an effect started to take hold of them, and after that entire scene happened, our protagonist kept staring at him. They then turned around, and our protagonist, on the other side, could only see all those faces acting. But after a little while, they achieved what they wanted. Both of them became a bit younger again. And at that moment, as he got closer, he realized he no longer had wrinkles or age spots. As he approached, our protagonist just wondered if he was okay. He ignored our hero because at that moment, he even started crying because he had regained his youth. But since he had regained his youth, there was a catch. It was very likely that later that night, his stomach would experience a backlash. However, after that backlash, he would return to being somewhat normal again. At that moment, as he talked about it, our protagonist was received with a warm hug from him. As he hugged him, he mentioned that he owed a lot to our protagonist because he had managed to restore his youth, but at that moment, he just stood there crying. Our protagonist then raised the question of why he wanted to become younger. Maybe he thought that growing old meant becoming too weak, but he replied that this was not the case. He actually cherished his immortality. However, the need to consume raw meat and blood every day had become tiresome, and he was sick of it. So he preferred to go back a bit in time because drinking blood and eating raw meat had become as routine as breathing, and he had grown tired of it. He then somewhat understood this, which surprised our protagonist. However, what surprised him even more was something else that happened right then. He looked ahead and saw his other brother, who was gathering several used food shells and then putting them in his mouth. He began to eat those leftovers without stopping once, and after eating a little, he even started crying because it had been so long since he last tasted real food. Then, the vampire clan commented that the mummy's family had always used methods to extend their lives, but to do that, they had to empty their organs, preserving only the shell and their consciousness. Because of this, he had permanently lost his sense of taste and smell. For over 4,000 years, He hadn't experienced the taste of meat or the flavor of any good food. Knowing this, our protagonist simply ignored it but eventually stood up and approached him, asking him to eat slowly. However, he handed him something quite special. It was Chinese milk tea. For him, it was a delicacy. Without knowing where he had gotten that Chinese tea, he simply took it and thanked our protagonist, perhaps because he saw it as a way to feel superior since he was a few months older than him. Nonetheless, he took it and drank it, but upon drinking it, he began to feel a tingling sensation in his mouth that even made him spit a little fire. On the other hand, our hero just laughed. While all of this was happening, the vampire was just observing everything, but there was also a curious eye watching from behind the wall, silently witnessing everything happening here, something that he would likely use against them later. However, in a distant past, thousands of years ago, on this very planet Earth, there truly existed an ancient demon lord with eternal life. What no one knew was that he possessed the power of eternal life, including over the demons themselves. He was practically omniscient and all-powerful. He led the demons in a relentless operation against humanity. In an effort to prevent this evil from destroying them, humanity united as one and launched a final battle. By the end of the battle, they eventually managed to defeat and seal the Demon King. Initially, humanity aimed to completely eradicate the existence of this monster, but suppressing him was impossible because the Demon King's power was far too great. It was almost impossible to annihilate him completely. So, humanity reached an agreement to send this Demon King to a dismemberment platform. But to do that, they needed to find certain humans. After a long time, they managed to find 3 humans with the greatest potential. To suppress his power, they separated, and as the years passed, the family responsible for suppressing the body basically became the zombie family. Another family responsible for suppressing the blood became the vampire family, and the one responsible for suppressing the skeleton became the mummy family. And so, after all that, it became the origin of what everyone in this era, with all the biting going on, ends up calling mummy, vampire, and that bloodsucker. With this, he ends up giving him a pair of unlocking talismans with an expiration period of only 1 year. After this year passes, both of them need to go to him so that he can give them another one, allowing them to use it every 6 months. Once the time was up, they could return there again. After a few years, they eventually agreed with the idea, but there was Yahello, right? Before they could leave, he asked them to wait a little because he had a rather troubling question in his mind. He wanted to know how our protagonist survived for so long and what the negative effects were for managing to survive all that time. He then starts looking around, realizing that no one else was there, and only after that does he say that it was a long story, so he should probably opt to tell it later. But then, out of nowhere, someone appears and says that he ended up losing his precious buddy down there. Well, he gets startled and wonders how she appeared out of nowhere. In response, she says she sensed something hours ago in the room. She even thought he had been kidnapped, but she just stayed quietly observing everything. However, as an apprentice, she should only watch her master, and for some reason she ended up finding him in this situation again. She feels sad because her dear heart wouldn't handle another blow like this. Moreover, she kind of asks him to stay cool since she wasn't the kind of person to go around telling the world that he didn't have a buddy down there. But aside from that, even though he wasn't a man, she couldn't quite understand the pain that our protagonist kept talking about. After all, she had been following him for a long time and knew quite a lot about his situation. And the moment she mentions this, she starts attacking, striking our protagonist in sensitive spots. At this moment, Pharaoh shows up and tries to calm the situation down. Besides, she had grown tired of humiliating our protagonist. However, before leaving, she mentions a certain book that he needed to get and read. Now that she had left, the two brothers finally understood how our protagonist was the one who had suffered the most. They had been through relatively simple situations, but now that it was all over, he turns to his brothers and then asks where they got the idea that our protagonist, for some reason, had this Starl man thing of turning back to his youth. This leaves him quite confused. His brothers, on the other hand, were about to answer, But suddenly our protagonist, who had been completely fine, starts acting weird. He suddenly feels nauseous, crouches down, and then things start coming out of his mouth. His brothers who were there get startled and wonder what was happening. Something was leaking out, not just from his mouth, but also from the mouths of his two brothers who were there, going through the same thing as our protagonist. Both of them fall to their knees, and from our hero's mouth, a ball comes out. At that moment, not only from our hero's mouth, but also from the mouths of his other two brothers, similar balls emerge. As soon as these balls came out, they started floating and then moved toward the door. After those balls disappeared with a flash near the ceiling, we see our protagonist trying to regain his consciousness. But when he looks up, he is surprised by something, as those balls had turned into a mouth. That thing started bouncing between the houses, and after bouncing around for a bit, it went out the door. At that moment, Pharaoh yells to his brothers, telling them to run because they needed to catch that thing. Meanwhile, in the city, we find them chasing after the ball as it bounces off. Everything. Buildings, cars, drawing everyone's attention. People wonder what that thing could be. The ball eventually bounces into some buildings and ends up in an alley. And by some miracle, it falls right into a trash can. The moment it lands in that trash can, we see our protagonist and the others arriving there. They then realize that the thing fell in there. But at that moment, a noise starts coming from inside the trash can. The three brothers simply stop and try to listen closely to what's going on, but our hero is surprised. He couldn't understand how they managed to let things get to this point. It turned into a small R demon, knowing that it couldn't let that thing live. It uses a talisman, it's E, and the moment it uses it, an air energy arrow appears in its hand, and only after that does it go in the direction of that baby R demon. At that moment, it ends up hitting it, but the full power it used has no effect on it. Now that everything was perhaps resolved or not, they end up kind of understanding that maybe all of this only happened because they ate that unlocking talisman, and that is probably the full explanation for everything that happened. However, after a while, that can started to move a little, and they noticed that it was moving more and more until, at some point, something appeared. But then it disappeared. They even understood that its power was getting weaker and weaker. Maybe it was dying. But the joke it just made was a total lie. Our hero attacked it with one of the most powerful strikes, but nothing happened to it. So how could it be dying so easily as it had just claimed? Now that everything had happened and been resolved, our scene shifts to a house where we see her, now more calm and relaxed, until one of them realizes that this had turned into a girl. He wonders how, especially since a few years ago, he fought against it in the past. But back then, it was a man and was quite powerful. While both of them were arguing about something like this, they turned around and, at the same time, tried to find our protagonist. There, they found him completely shaken, because he knew that if he stayed there, he would be arrested. The guy even invited our protagonist to visit Egypt, but just as he thought he was going to leave, a few steps appeared outside the room. It was some guards, who soon after forced the door open, and once they did, there were the guards. And one of them was that girl. Seeing the situation, she understood everything. While this scene takes place in another location, the guy who kind of made our hero work in the hall ends up being surprised by the news he just received from these guys. To him, everything seemed to be going well, until he realized that everything was going too perfect, which he already found suspicious. As he pondered this, our scene returns to them. They were walking through the city, and while they walked, our protagonist and his two brothers were already by his side. As they walked, our protagonist commented that he was the one who put them in this situation, so he would take full responsibility for whatever was happening. But the moment he said this, another guy appeared in the background, only to comment that he had just done something very dangerous, and that he had no idea about the danger he had put himself in. But since the guard asked him to stop, as it wasn't good to keep arguing there, while they talked about this, someone appeared in front of them. It was his old disciple who was there. He understood the whole situation, but he didn't know if he could endure being in all of this, something he couldn't quite grasp. So he asked for an explanation, and in response, he commented that he knew how to draw the unlocking talisman, and this secret had already been passed on to his two brothers, who were eager to know how he did it. So all he needed was to gather them at the banquet. After bringing them together, he just stood behind the wall observing everything that was happening. He only needed to wait because the rejuvenation process had to be done. If all three of them rejuvenated, this type of sealing would be broken. After explaining this, they asked why he did it, and he responded by saying that he had always been humiliated by everyone. On top of that, he was abandoned by his own family. He was treated like an abandoned dog, and to make things worse, he had to endure what others couldn't. As he continued to complain, our protagonist and his other brother just watched, while one of the guards asked him to be quiet. But he didn't stop. He kept saying that she was the reincarnation of the demon Chi, but she could also be a new vessel for the demon's power. But even if she was the vessel, a vessel basically requires another sacrifice. So if they manage to break the next seal, it's very likely that the Demon King will descend into the world, and that little baby will absorb all the energy being released. In the end, it would basically be another way to reincarnate that red demon. To make things worse, he commented that the baby had already been sent to the autopsy room, and if they continued with the surgery, it was very likely that it would be impossible to go back. It would be too late. This was also the only chance he had in this life. And besides, it was practically a direct order from the king of the zombies. And to make things even clearer, if the protagonist wanted to invade that place, it was simple. It was just go there. But if he goes there, he will never be seen again. He's leaving there to live his life again. But at this moment talking about it, his brothers end up breaking those chains quickly. The guard doesn't like what they just did either. Now free, we then see the guard opening his mouth, asking them to stay handcuffed because they weren't going to do anything with them so far. They needed to be taken for judgment. But the vampire asks him to shut up because this was a personal matter. The mummy, on the other hand, also tells him to shut up. Meanwhile, he was talking to our protagonist, calling for him. He asks his sister to wait because his goal was to find that child. But before he could do anything, he asks for an explanation of what was going on. Meanwhile, the scene changed to another location. He commented that because of the food from the previous night that wasn't eaten, they couldn't be doing much. Moreover, the servant who entered the room without permission was surprised because he couldn't find Lord Cesar, who had disappeared, which at that moment left the other vampire a little irritated. So, on his knees, he commented that the family had practically just arrived and said that he felt the contract vehicle of the master loosening a bit. The elder also said that this matter was important and that they should send the vampire family's elite to track him down as quickly as possible because the master had used some methods to break some contracts. Then they simply told him to relax because they would send this person after him. Meanwhile, the scene cuts to another location. In this place, we find the baby from earlier, who was now going through certain surgeries. One of the doctors was curious about what the other could be doing, and the other just responded that they could do whatever they wanted because their goal was to make the Demon King be reborn soon. But before they could finish, the other was curious if they could at least take her skin, which irritated the other doctor because this thing wouldn't be taken by her, but by him. He couldn't wait anymore. So he distractedly began the surgery, but before getting any closer, we then hear a sound that scares both of them, and at the moment that sound appears, a shadow shows up behind them. This shadow was of our protagonist. Before anything could happen, our hero used that rejuvenation talisman, and shortly after consuming it, he returned to his youth. Now he asks them to stop, then starts running as fast as possible in their direction. At that moment, the doctors step back, but our hero almost reaches them. However, before getting there, some of the guards appeared, and when they showed up, they attacked our protagonist. Of course, to avoid being caught, he used his fastest defense. He kicked the man back and then used a talisman to strike a blow in the air, but the guard managed to dodge it with an iron bar in hand, trying to strike our protagonist with it. But it wasn't over because his talisman hadn't finished yet. He turned around where the talisman hit the two, breaking that iron bar. Only after that did he throw the two guards against the wall. But now that he had avoided the guards, he ran toward that man. As he was running, we then saw other guards disappearing. However, he realized that things were getting out of hand because the doctor had started the surgery, and he knew that if he waited any longer, that demon king would be invoked. To prevent this, he summoned his treasure. He told her to come out, and when he did, she appeared. Before anything could happen, he asked her to deal with these guys in front of him. This was done because she would be taking care of each of them. These men, seeing her, used special methods to try to seal her. But when she saw this, she simply used her claws, making several cuts. The cuts were enough to bring down the three guards that were there. Only after knocking them down did she find these men weak. While she took care of the guards, our protagonist passed by her and ran toward the doctor. At that moment, he was getting closer and closer to the surgery. With each passing moment, he lost consciousness, and the guy just kept getting crazier because he wanted to continue with it more and more. He kept seeing the Demon King appear in this world, but our protagonist appeared behind him. His goal was to end him. But then that guy from before showed up, interrupting everything and ultimately protecting the doctor while commenting if the surgery was over. At that moment, he was sad for him, because they had both worked together, knowing that he had betrayed him. He could end him as quickly as possible, and it had also been a while since he last gave him a kick there. So he raised his foot and hit him in his important parts, and at that moment, he felt the pain. The pain was so strong that he couldn't stay standing. He now knew he could end this guy as quickly as possible. So, he summoned a sword from his talisman, and only after that did he ask that this guy disappear as quickly as possible because he couldn't continue with that surgery on that girl. Of course, his goal was to stop it. But there's that catch. Will our protagonist be able to do it? Well, if he will, I don't know. Because here, unfortunately, we'll have to find out all of that in the next part. But before I go, leave a comment below on what you thought of this chapter. Did you like this chapter? Do you want a continuation of it here on the channel? Also, comment below on which character you liked the most, the protagonist, or the friend he made there, or other characters. But before I leave, don't forget to leave your like, and if possible, subscribe to the channel. But now, I think I'm going to leave. Maybe I'll see you around. I'll only see you now in the next part.